The world has more than its fair share of weird, sadistic, and even downright cruel leaders. Only one of them is peed on hats.
I'm the famous Greek general, Alexander the Great. This is his real armor and everything. I had them dig up his grave so I could wear it.
Most Roman emperors were bonkers, but some of them were extra, and the most extra of all, the most bonkers of all the bonkers emperors was Caligula. And yes, that really happened. He dug up Alexander the Great's armor. Well, supposedly, but he was still nuts. You've heard that Caligula once made his horse a senator, and maybe he did, but much of what we know about Caligula comes from a historian who lived several decades after his death. So all those stories about Caligula having meaningful conversations with the moon and feeding his horse oats mixed with flakes of gold are a little suspect. And there are other Caligula legends, like one that says during a campaign in Britain, he told his soldiers to stop doing what they were doing and collect seashells. He supposedly once ordered a bunch of boats to line up and form a bridge across the Bay of Naples so he could gallop gleefully across it. Caligula was eventually assassinated by his own Praetorian Guard, which is not something that tends to happen to beloved rulers. Imagine if the leader of your nation decided everyone had to start worshipping a smiley face, and also all evidence of the previous religion would be erased and replaced with pictures of the smiley face. The pharaoh Akhenaten's god wasn't exactly a smiley face, but it was a yellow circle with rays coming out of it.
He called it the Aten.
Akhenaten told everyone that the Aten was the one and only god, which, for a population that had always had tons of gods, made him feel poor.
How poor are they?
Thank you. They are so poor that they have only one god.
Throw in the fact that they had badass jackal-headed gods and eagle gods and zombie gods, it felt like a downgrade to the average Egyptian. Akhenaten, who was called the heretic king by his own people, was so obsessed with the Aten that he built a whole new capital in the god's honor, and he chose the location mostly because the sunrise looked cool there. And when Akhenaten died roughly 17 years later, pretty much all of Egypt pretended like he never existed and erased him from history, much in the same way he tried to erase the old gods. Dare we say karma? In fact, the Egyptians were so successful that no one had ever heard of Akhenaten until the 19th century, when some inscriptions were found that mentioned his name. New pharaoh? Who dis? Incidentally, Akhenaten is now credited with creating the world's oldest known monotheistic religion. He was also the father of the most famous pharaoh of them all, King Tut. Lots of people didn't love college or high school or school in general. And maybe there are those out there who thought about peeing on your economics textbook or in your roommate's shoe, but you never actually did because you're not weird and also not an emperor who lived a couple millennia ago. Then there's Chinese Emperor Liu Bang. He didn't like Confucian teachings. In fact, he was so hostile to Confucian scholars that he grabbed the hats off their heads and pee in them. We mean that literally. Evidently, Liu Bang's dislike of scholars persisted until one of his advisors convinced them that he could conquer a kingdom with force, but only keep it with knowledge. After that, Liu Bang became somewhat more open to teachings of Confucianism, and hopefully stopped peeing in people's hats when he disagreed with them. Most people deal with flies by swatting them, or maybe by chasing them with a tennis racket-shaped bug zapper. But if you happen to be both a sadist and a pharaoh, you have other options. Pharaoh Pepi II ruled Egypt around 4,300 years ago. He was in power for between 64 and 94 years, depending on whom you ask. And he really, really hated flies. In fact, he hated flies so much that he came up with a unique way of dealing with them. He'd pour honey on naked slaves and turn them into human fly paper.
No Egyptian household is complete without one. I got one in every room, and I got a lot of rooms.
Evidently, this was pretty effective.
But there are no flies on me.
But if it was really just the honey that did the job, one has to wonder why Pepi didn't just smear it all over the statue of his least favorite relative or something. Of course, it's hard to be a terrifying, all-powerful sadist if you're only humiliating a statue. Priorities. Who among us hasn't dreamed of having an entire swimming pool full of whatever it is we like to guzzle, whether it's chocolate, beer, or tomato basil soup? And if you never did before, now you are. But no one is actually crazy enough to go through with it. No one except Zhou Xin, king of the Sheng dynasty, who lived roughly 3,000 years ago. And forget the swimming pool, he ordered up a lake full of wine. But that wasn't enough. There was also an island with trees of meat, and that's not a metaphor, that's a literal description. On each tree was a bunch of skewered roasted meat, so the emperor could paddle across his lake of wine, grab himself a cup of Merlot as he disembarked, and then pluck meat off the trees. He would also invite thousands of people over and tell them to frolic naked in the lake of wine. And that's full frolicking with all the extras.
Doesn't seem sanitary.
How do you decontaminate a lake of wine in which 3,000 people have been full frolicking? Ew. Look, it doesn't take a psychotherapist to know that if you raise your kid in a prison, that kid will grow up weird, even if you name that prison something nice like the Golden Cage.
I mean, come on! It's a no-brainer!
The Ottoman Empire isn't actually ancient history. It ran from 1299 to 1922, but they most definitely had some primitive practices. For example, Ottoman princes lived in a golden cage, which was basically a windowless chamber where they spent all their time, so they wouldn't do anything sketchy like overthrow the current ruler or, learn things. According to the Ottomans, when Sultan Ibrahim I's brother died in 1640, and he was up next, he was so insane from years of confinement that he refused to come out of the cage unless he saw his brother's corpse. Then he did nothing but hang out with his harem and roll around on furs for the 8 years he was in power. He was so obsessed with furs, in fact, that the French called him the Fur Man, because apparently the French are terrible at nicknames. Ibrahim kept fish and fed them with coins instead of actual food, though presumably someone else later came along with fish flakes. And one night, in a fit of insanity, he had all 280 of his concubines put into sacks and drowned in the Bosporus, but at least he still had his furs. The Roman Emperor Domitian ruled from 51 to 96 AD, was bald as a cue ball and didn't want anyone to know it, so he demanded that artists always depict him with flowing locks. Which has us wondering, did he wear a wig of flowing locks when he was out in public? Or was it a case of the emperor has no hair?
You're bald!
Domitian was cruel and also really into arena sports, which was a terrible combination in a Roman emperor. One of his favorite things was watching gladiatorial combat between women and little people. He also loved psychological torture. He'd sometimes invite enemies to dinner, send them home that night feeling safe and secure, and have the executioner wake them up first thing the next morning. Psych! Plenty of Roman emperors had god complexes, but Domitian's was especially obnoxious. He insisted on being called master and god, which the aristocracy almost certainly would have found funny if it weren't for the whole wine, dine, death thing. Oh, and Domitian liked to stab flies with a pen and tear their wings off, which is crazy because it's a lot easier just to douse slaves with honey to get rid of them.
Ancient Chinese rulers collected concubines like Pokemon cards.
Some had so many that if they spent one night with each one, it would take years to get through all of them. And when Emperor Wu, who took the Chinese throne in 265, defeated his rival Sun Hao, he ended up with an extra 5,000 ladies. Suddenly, the Grand Emperor found himself paralyzed with indecision, because how exactly does one decide which one of your thousands of concubines to spend the night with? If you answer goats, you're like no one else ever in history of anything, because having goats make your decisions about your life is straight up crazy. But that's exactly what Emperor Wu did. He climbed aboard a little cart pulled by goats, let them go wherever they felt like going, and then he'd spend the night in the first place they stopped, which for his sake was hopefully not the pasture where all the rest of the goats were. The ladies knew this, so they would put salt licks and bamboo and other things goats dig in front of their doors in hopes that the emperor would stop there. And then they would try to pretend like they weren't romancing a wacko whose social life was controlled by ruminants. In 565 AD, Justin II became Emperor of Byzantium, and for a while he did a pretty okay job. He expanded the empire into southern Europe and Italy, and he was fairly tolerant of religious differences in his kingdom. But then he invaded Persia. Not only were the Persians totally not down with being invaded, they did a little reciprocal invading, and pretty soon the Byzantine city of Dara was in Persian hands. At this point, Justin started behaving badly, really badly. He mostly just bit everyone who came close to him and ordered his musicians to play organ music on repeat in the hope that it might help him chill out. Ah yes, the calming tones of an organ. At this point, Justin's wife convinced him to adopt as his son a military leader named Tiberius, who took over Justin's royal duties and eventually became the emperor. History doesn't tell us how he felt about organ music. Zhu Houzhao came to the Chinese throne when he was 13 years old, which is actually not that young by ancient ruler standards, but is absolutely insane if you've ever tried to get a 13-year-old to do anything they don't want to do. So when he rose to power, it shouldn't have been too surprising that he wasn't ready to leave his childish pursuits behind him. And unfortunately for all those who knew him, Zhu Houzhao liked to pretend play, which meant his entire entourage had to also pretend play, or pay the very imperial consequences. According to historian David M. Robinson, the emperor's games range from pretending to be a shopkeeper, fairly harmless, to roaming the streets in disguise and kidnapping the daughters of wealthy families, the opposite of harmless. He also invented an alter ego named Zhu, mostly so he could tell everyone how awesome Zhu was. and this wasn't just something he outgrew. Zhu Houzhao kept on acting like a child until he fell out of his fishing boat in the Grand Canal, nearly drowned, and languished for a few months before dying at the age of 29. Ancient leaders tended to be paranoid, and with good reason. There was always someone who wanted to overthrow you. So you were constantly on the lookout for poison, assassins, and honey-covered slaves who were really sick of standing around attracting flies all day long. And that kind of max paranoia led to plenty of minor paranoias, which would often morph into weird behavior. Such was the case of Sheng, who was blind in one eye and thought everyone was mocking him for it. So, being all-powerful, he banned the words less, lacking, missing, and without. Which means if you were hanging out with Sheng and you said the words, "Crap, I left the house without my coin purse this morning," you'd be executed. Sheng wasn't just a jerk about the whole eyeball thing, he was an all-around jerk. When his astrologers prophesied that there would be a royal death in China if he didn't mend his ways, he decided to preemptively fulfill the prophecy. So he executed his wife, his father-in-law, and his uncle. Guess he showed you, prophets.